Welcome everyone to our afternoon session here. This is kind of the more of the workshop part of it. I think it's a good idea. You're going to get some really valuable insights into how Washington works and how news reporters cover Washington. I'm going to let Jamie go first. What we'll do is we'll talk a little bit about how we do our jobs as reporters, how Washington works, which, you know, for most people it takes a long time just to understand the mechanics of Washington. And then that's really the starting point for good news coverage. So let me turn it over to Jamie, and then we'll go through this. I think we have about an hour and a half, and we'll make certain we'll leave plenty of time for questions too. Okay.
Okay, well, as you may recall from the morning session, I spent most of my time covering the U.S. military from the safety of the Pentagon, although I did, during the time that I was first CNN military affairs correspondent and then CNN senior Pentagon correspondent, I did, in fact, travel to all the war zones, usually after the bullets had stopped flying or the bombs had stopped falling. But sometimes there was a little excitement while we were there as well. Mostly, though, when I traveled with senior officials, either senior military officials or the defense secretary on official trips. Occasionally, I would go by myself to war zones. But most of my reporting, excuse me, was done in the Pentagon. And the role of the Pentagon reporter is to take all the information that we get, not just from your own sources inside and outside the Pentagon, but also from the other reporters in your organization who are actually located where things are going on. And through using your experience, using your trusted sources who have been reliable in the past, try to put together a bigger picture of what's going on, what it means, you know, whether you're winning the war or losing the war, whether the strategy is working, whether what the government is saying actually reflects what's going on the ground. And one of the things that you discover, excuse me, and this is true whether you're a reporter or whether you're a senior government official or a military officer, is that what you hear at the Pentagon rarely matches up with what's actually going on in the field when there are operations going on. And this is a challenge again. I would sometimes travel with senior military officials, and that was a challenge for them too, because when you go to a war zone, if you go to Afghanistan, for instance, today you'll be treated to used to be flip charts, but now it's PowerPoint briefings on how much progress is being made, how much things are better than the last time. But over time, if you do this year after year, you discover that actually things are not getting any better, they're not any different. And if you can actually talk to the people who are actually conducting the operations, you often get a much different perspective than what you get from the Pentagon briefing. A couple of things about how you get information from the Pentagon. When I first arrived at the Pentagon in 1992, I was named the Pentagon correspondent in November of 1992. President Bush was leaving, Defense Secretary Cheney was leaving, the new Clinton administration was coming in, and I thought I'd have a little time to sort of figure out how the place worked. And of course, within a couple of weeks, the U.S. was intervening in Somalia. And that was sort of my, one of the standard rules of journalism is as soon as you get assigned someplace where you think you'll have some time to figure it out, something big happens right away. And one of the interesting dynamics about the Pentagon is we talked a little bit earlier today about why sources leak, why information comes out that's supposedly not supposed to be released. And a lot of times it's simply to develop a relationship with the reporter. A lot of these people know that they're going to need the news media, they're going to need you at some point, so they want to do little favors for you now that are easy to do so that you'll A, trust them, and B, be more favorably disposed to them. And I was a beneficiary of this policy when I first arrived at the Pentagon, because I get to the Pentagon, the U.S. is landing in Somalia, the Marines are landing, the Marine Reconnaissance Forces are landing in Somalia, and I'm brand new there. I've only been there 2 weeks. I pretty much have a handle on the policy, but I don't know a lot of what's going on. And I'm live at the Pentagon, and somebody from the Navy decides to assign a young naval officer to come down to the Pentagon briefing room and help me out, because I'm clearly kind of lost. So I'm watching the live feed on CNN from Somalia, and I'm watching this hovercraft come ashore with Marines on it, and I've got right next to me off camera is a young lieutenant commander who's been dispatched by Navy Public Affairs to, build some rapport with the new Pentagon correspondent. And I'm saying to him, Joe, this hovercraft that's coming ashore, what is that? And he said, well, that's an LCAC. And I said, well, LCAC, what does LCAC stand for? He said, well, that's Landing Craft Air Cushion. And I said, so what would be on there? And he said, well, it'd have light armored vehicles and, that sort of thing. And then not more than about a minute later, Bernie Shaw, who's the anchor on CNN, comes to me and says, now let's go to our man at the Pentagon. Jamie McIntyre is there. Jamie, what are we seeing here? And I said, well, Bernie, this hovercraft that's coming ashore is what's known as an LCAC. That stands for Landing Craft Air Cushion. And it would have light armored vehicles and that sort of thing on it. And they did this all night as young Commander Joe Gradisher stood just off camera and explained to me what everything was as I was seeing it. Like this ship offshore, what's that? He said, it's the USS Mount Whitney. I said, what is that? He says, it's a command and control ship. It has all kinds of space. And I would come to me and I'd say, and that ship, Bernie, I believe is the USS Mount Whitney, if I'm not mistaken. So I get home that night, I'm feeling pretty good, the coverage is going pretty good. I get home that night and I said to my wife, I said, so did you see me on CNN? Did you see me? How did? She says, wow, yeah, I did see. She said, how did you know all that stuff? I said, honey, it's my job to know that stuff. But the point is, there are a lot of people at the Pentagon who will help you out, especially on sort of routine things. But one of the most valuable lessons I learned early on, and then I'll turn this over to Bill, and we want to leave plenty of time for a question. But you think that getting information is hard from the Pentagon, and it is. Ferreting out secret information isn't easy. And after a while, you sort of learn how the game works. And while the perception is, and sometimes this does happen, the perception is that you get some sort of big dump all at once. Somebody gives you, it's like WikiLeaks, they just give you all the secret stuff, and then you just report it. But often it's this long sort of detective process where you get a tiny piece of information here, and then a tiny piece of information there, and then you use that piece of information to play off, to pretend that you know more than you do, and confront somebody who then thinks you already have most of the story, and then they feel compelled to help you get the rest of it to put it in the right context, and then you use that. Then you circle back to the original person who didn't really tell you much at all, but gave you enough to start, and then by that time they think you've already been given this story, and you piece it together. And what would happen is if you were to go back and question all 12 people you may have talked to in the course of a day or two, each one of them could honestly say, I didn't give him the story. I mean, all I told him was he was way off track, which, by the way, can be very helpful. And, they could honestly say, I didn't leak the story to them, but in fact, they were all the source of the story. But the most valuable thing you can get is not information. It's the question to ask. The hardest thing to discover at the Pentagon is like once you know that you should be asking about something, that something is going on, then you can sort of drill down on it and find out. But the hardest thing is knowing what questions to ask, knowing what you should be pursuing. And there's a number of ways that you can get at that. I mean, one of the things is, there's so much rivalry within the government, between the State Department and the Pentagon, and between the Air Force and the Army and the civilians, and one department after. You can play them off each other. And one common way to get reporters from looking into something you don't want to look at too deeply is to throw them a bone and send them in a different direction. It's like you go to the Navy to look at some overpriced, warship, and they say, you should look at that Air Force tanker deal. I hear there's something really going on with that. And they send you off that way. And I'll just tell you one quick story about this, and then we'll take your questions wherever you want to take this. So again, early in my career at the Pentagon, CNN calls me up, and this is at the beginning of the Clinton administration. There was a move to lift the ban on, that changed the Pentagon policy about gays in the military. And back then, it was actually part of the Uniform Code of Military Justice that gays couldn't serve in the military. There was a line in there that said homosexuality is incompatible with military service. And the Clinton administration was going to change that. And it was a big controversy. And CNN wanted me to do a piece on that. So I, of course, as I explained, the Pentagon's this big open building and you can wander around. So I sat wandering around the building trying to find out what's going on with the gay in the military policy. And I run into this Pentagon official and I say, look, I need to know what's going on with this policy. Where's this heading? And he says, you don't want to ask about that. You don't want to know that. I said, yeah, no, that's what I want to know. CNN, they called me. That's what the story they want me to do today. He said, no, you don't want to do that. And I said, no. And it's like, I'm thinking, where's this guy get off telling me what story I'm going to do? I'm the reporter here. I get to decide what story I'm doing. And I'm pushing him, and he finally says, look, you don't get it. You don't get it. It's not gays. It's not gays. He says, I said, what do you mean? He says, Somalia. I said, well, what about, so I did a story about Somalia yesterday. He says, Somalia. Somalia. And then he walks off. And, I'm not the sharpest tool in the shed, but I'm beginning to think, maybe I should ask about Somalia. I'm just thinking, maybe that's where I should go. And of course, it turned out the U.S. that night was going to conduct a raid against Mohammed Farah Aidid, who was the leader of the Somali faction that we thought was the key to success in Somalia. And of course, by knowing a little bit about, so now I'm using this technique. I'm going around saying, hey, I hear this, Somalia, something, but then like, where'd you hear that? It's like, and you can tell, the one thing you can tell the Pentagon is the advantage of like not doing things over the phone, but actually going to see people is they react differently when you see them in person. So like maybe an office you go into every day, everybody's pretty casual, suddenly or somebody you can talk to every day suddenly is not available, they just can't see you, or you come in and people start turning papers over in their office, when you walk in, something is up. A long story short, but as the course of the day, by using one little piece of information and then pretending I knew more and then going to somebody else and pretending to do, I figured out about 4 p.m. that this big raid was going off, going to go that night. And of course, it wasn't something we could report ahead of time because this would compromise the mission. But what I did do was I called CNN and I said, this was back before the internet and all the communications we have today. So CNN, devising a cover story that it was going to do a special on Somalia, bought up all available satellite time out of Mogadishu that night. And then I get this call back from the president of CNN and says, Jamie, we've just spent $75,000 buying all the satellite time, so I hope their sources are right, because otherwise this is costing us a lot of money. And so now I'm really nervous, because I'm thinking, so of course, the raid went off as expected. We were expecting it. We had the exclusive because nobody else could get satellite time out of there. We're all over it. I'm a big hero, and because of that, I get to keep my job for another 16 years. But the point of that is, if you can get the questions, the answers will come, usually.
Okay. What I want to do is give you a little bit of an overview about covering Washington and share with you my experience in doing this for 26 years. It's been absolutely an incredible career for me. I mean, like I say, if I walked away from the news business, I'd have no regrets. I've been all over the world. I've covered some amazing stories. I've traveled to former Soviet missile bases in the middle of Siberia and places like that. And it's just been, one thing that you don't often get from reporters is that it's a lot of fun. I mean, I really had a lot of fun. In fact, Jamie and I, we had some fun on a number of trips to Asia. We traveled with the Secretary of Defense, and you get to go in motorcades, and you fly on a plane that doesn't stop for 24 hours as it refuels in the air several times. But first, a little bit about the news business. Obviously, you have to answer the question, what is news? And in Washington, the main industry here is government, and government and politics are the main thing. If you go to New York, it's finance. Los Angeles, it's entertainment. But here, it's government. So the focus on news here is mainly about government. And government is made up of the 3 branches, but then there's all the trade associations and lobbyists and all of these. A very good movie to understand the lobby side of things is a movie that came out fairly recently called Casino Jack, about Jack Abramoff, which kind of gives you a flavor about the freewheeling lobbyist scene that ended up putting him in prison. The state of the news business today, as I'm sure you're aware, that's obviously the big question. Will there be newspapers in the next 10, 15 years? There will be newspapers. I'm confident of that. What format they'll be in, I'm not so confident of. The problem today is that print readership is declining. and digital readership is increasing, but the money that was used to fund newspapers from advertisements is not migrating at the same rate to the digital side. I think the figures for 2009 were that $45 billion was spent in print ads, but only about $5 billion was spent on digital ads. So that's a big problem. Nobody's really figured out how to monetize this new digital world. And the culture right now is that everybody wants it free. They're starting to look at paywalls and how to do those things. But so that's the real dilemma for newspapers. The other downside of that is that most of the content that appears on the internet comes from established news organizations, the ones that were built with brick and mortar and established. So there's certainly uncertainty about about the future. A little bit about the news gathering process. It's fast-paced, especially for a daily newspaper, and it's driven by a strong sense of competition. There are lots of reporters out there, hundreds, perhaps maybe thousands of reporters kind of covering the same thing you do. Also, there are trade associations and trade journals, specialized publications that focus on government regulation or energy or very specific things. But for a general interest newspaper, there's a lot of competition. There's generally two types of reporting that we do. One we call breaking news, which is where the Secretary of Defense or someone will hold a press conference or will appear before Congress, and you have to find the story there. I can remember starting out as a young reporter in the 1980s, and it was very difficult for me to find out what was going on, what was the news out of a story. And it took a long time to get that experience, and after a while, after you cover something for a long time, it almost becomes second nature, that you know that something has been said maybe several months ago, and then something is said even slightly different, and it represents something that has gone on behind the scenes. They've had, dozens of high-level government meetings, and they made a decision, and they've changed the policy. So it's a news story, and you have to figure out how they changed the policy, why they changed it, what's the significance of it, and then you have to put all of that into a story through technical writing. And of course, reporters don't operate alone. They have to have good editors, and editors provide experience. They provide the reality check, and they can also be a pain in the ass. I mean, anybody that's ever had to deal with editors, I've been very fortunate to have good editors, especially in covering national security affairs. For example, during the Clinton administration, one of the really big areas where we, as a newspaper, were able to carve out a niche was on the issue of missile defense. And it was pretty easy to understand why. What was going on then was back in 91, during the first Gulf War, the largest single number of casualties occurred when a Scud missile was fired from Iraq into Saudi Arabia, and it landed on a barracks in Dhahran, killed a number of people. And so the military understood that they needed some defenses against these missiles, which are relatively unguided, but yet they can do tremendous damage. And at the same time, the Clinton administration, very much like the current administration, had adopted what I call a pro-arms control approach to defense. It wasn't the Reagan view of peace through strength. It was peace through negotiations. The only problem with that is that, in international affairs, the U.S. is usually the only one that negotiates honestly and not in its own interest. And so what you end up with is you have agreements that restrict the U.S. while other nations violate them. Well, here you had a situation where the Clinton administration was very enamored with a 1972 arms control treaty called the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. And it basically said that we won't build defenses against nuclear missiles, so their way will be vulnerable and things will be stable. And they don't like missile defense because they think that it creates instability, when in fact, if you can defend against missiles, you don't have to worry about the offensive missiles. Anyway, it was an offensive, defensive thing. The Clinton people wanted to extend this long-range missile defense ban to short-range missiles, and the military was horrified. Their guys had died in a short-range missile attack. They didn't want to give up the ability to do very effective short-range missile defenses. Well, this is a classic case where you're going to get good news stories. It's not an easy area to cover. It was very technical. It had to do with interceptor speeds and velocities. The editors recognized that, hey, this is an area we can excel in. This is an area where we can carve out unique, exclusive coverage, and we did. And because there was this fight between the military that wanted short-range missile defenses and the political appointees who wanted to limit missile defenses, it became a great story for us. So that's kind of a good example of how you find good areas. That's what we call a breaking news area or an enterprise area, and that's a second category. Enterprise is where we also call investigative reporting. I'm reluctant to use the term investigative reporting because many times it's an excuse for reporters to write one story every 6 months. Very few news organizations have that luxury now. We at the Times, we have an investigative team, and they work away and they get inside stories and they develop pretty good stories. But you want to get stories that no one else has because it will drive people to read your newspaper or to go to your website. That's really the key. And again, it gets back to this competition. News sources, of course. This is really the key to being a good reporter, developing and keeping good sources. And as I said in my career, I've been very fortunate to be able to get excellent sources. I mean, if I were to really talk about all of it, it would probably, in this environment, lead to all kinds of investigations. But the most important thing is to protect your sources. Many times, people who provided me information, I had to protect them because it wasn't clear to them that what would happen if I reported something and whether or not they could be detected. It wasn't too long into my career that I found out that the CIA in particular had a whole shop of people who did nothing but read the newspaper and follow news reports and try to figure out where the information came from. In other words, they were hunting for leaks. But just a couple of examples. I mean, I had sources that were both people and also documents. People would provide documents on what was going on. And I can remember a case where I got a document that was highly classified, and in it, it disclosed that there was going to be a coup in a South American country. And I thought to myself, what am I going to do with this? I could have reported it straight. A classified document said there was going to be a coup in some South American country, but then I thought, well, what if there's not a coup? So, and what if I start, doing the legwork on this to find out, hey, do you know about this? Does anybody know about it? Anyway, so it was toward the end of the week, and I decided that I would make a few phone calls and see what the response was, because in this business, there's one thing that you can't do enough of, and that's ask questions. If you ask, there are really no dumb questions, but as long as you ask questions, you will be absolutely amazed to see what answers you get. In this case, I asked a few questions from some officials in government, and I said I'll wait on the weekend. And somehow over the weekend there was a report that came out, a wire report that said they had arrested a group of officers in South American country who were plotting a coup. So that it wasn't something that I really needed to report, but I think that to me it was amazing that I was getting access to this information. And of course, at the time, the government really did have a very hands-off approach to the press. It really wasn't until the second Bush administration that there developed within government kind of a group of people who felt that they were going to go after the press. that they were that the press was causing more damage than, even the worst spy cases that they've had. Now, my view is if you look at the spy cases that we've had, there's never been any disclosure in the press that's come close to what has happened through these betrayals of these spies. Hansen and Ames at the top of the list, but there's scores of them. And so they developed a group that went after reporters, and that's when they really started going after sources. And again, like I said, this is a business where you want to develop sources. How do you develop sources? It was mentioned this morning. One of the really good source pools is former officials. And within that group, people who have just left government are also very good sources. People that are about to leave government or about to retire also can be very good sources. Well, how do you meet these people? Well, I live in Maryland. I've lived in Maryland since the 70s. And it seems like I lived in Bowie for a long time, and it seemed like for every other house, somebody there worked for the National Security Agency, which is the most secretive agency in government. I mean, for a long time, people who worked for NSA, they just wouldn't say anything where they worked. Then after a while, it changed, loosened up a little bit, and they said, yeah, I work for the U.S. government. And I said, oh, well, what part of the U.S. government? Well, I can't tell you. And then it became a little looser, and they said, I work for the Defense Department. I said, whoa, you work at the Pentagon? No, I can't tell you where I work. And then finally they said they work for NSA. So then once they say NSA, they're not going to say anything else. But NSA is one of the most secretive government agencies, and it's also, without doubt, the most effective intelligence service in the world in terms of gathering information. I would say probably 80 to 90% of all the intelligence gathered by the U.S. government comes from the NSA, which does electronic eavesdropping and code breaking. And they do that through a number of means. They have ground stations, they have satellites that can intercept signals, they have aircraft, and it's just a huge, gigantic system. And to be able to gather that information, that's difficult, but then be able to sift it and find useful intelligence, that's really amazing. And of course, they don't like to tell their story. They're one of the more secret agencies. The CIA, on the other hand, has really changed in recent years. It's really become much more of a human intelligence agency. At least they've tried to do that. The problem there is that our human intelligence was decimated in the 70s when they made a conscious decision, look, human spying's too hard, it gets you in trouble, it's illegal in most places, so let's just do electronic spying. Well, you know what? You can't spy electronically on a terrorist group that doesn't use communications. I mean, even if bin Laden had a satellite phone, yeah. But anyway, so I'm getting a little bit off the topic there, but anyway, so I've covered these things, and I've dealt with incredible amounts of information. Sometimes to the point where I'd have to wait a certain point, and I'd have to write about it, and officials would, Bill Gertz is calling. What's he going to ask us about? And it was a really an amazing experience for me. I think one of the kind of a metaphor for my career is I got a haircut many years ago, and I was talking to the barber, and the barber, I told him I was a reporter, and he says, "Oh, have you met the president?" And I said, "No, but I read his mail." And what I meant by that was that somebody had actually leaked me a copy of a letter from Russian President Boris Yeltsin to Bill Clinton, and it talked about anti-satellite weapons. I mean, it was a great story. It revealed that the Russians had an anti-satellite missile, and that they wanted the U.S. to negotiate not to develop satellite weapons. But it was Dear Bill. And then I've gotten a lot of those kinds of stories in my career. If I were to think back at some of the bigger stories, one was a confidential memorandum of conversation between Bill Clinton and Boris Yeltsin. It was at a summit meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, where you had, it was right before Clinton was running for re-election, maybe I think late 90s, and in it, you have Clinton telling Yeltsin, look, Boris, you and I are both running for president. Let's not do anything to upset relations between our countries. And oh, by the way, Russia is blocking imports of U.S. chicken. And a lot of that chicken is made in Arkansas with my good friends down there. So is there any chance you can get your government to lift the ban on chicken? Anyway, it was just a great story. I mean, it wasn't, and the White House just went crazy. The Russians issued when we wrote the story about it, they said they issued a formal diplomatic protest that the government had leaked this confidential exchange between the two presidents. So, like I said, that's kind of let me see, I just want to check my notes and we'll see if there's, I'll sum up here. Okay. Okay. All right. Yeah, if I wanted to go through a few of the stories that kind of shaped my career, I mean, when I first started, and I wish Brian Kelley was here because I started in 1985, and that became known as the Year of the Spy. We had, like, I don't know, 5 or 6 major spy cases. So it was almost like a spy mania had gripped the government. They were prosecuting spies right and left. And first was John Walker, who provided codes, Navy codes, that actually would have allowed the Soviet Union to win if we had a hot war. And then there was a National Security Agency spy named Ronald Pelton. And I almost got in trouble over that because he had compromised a underwater listening program where the Navy had secretly gone and was able to tap underwater cables in the Russian Far East. And that was compromised by the spy. It was known as Ivy Bells. And the Russians knew about it, and the NSA knew about it, but nobody in the public knew about it. And the government was trying to prosecute this spy, but at the same time not let that information come out. So it was myself, a Washington Post reporter, and an NBC reporter who were threatened with prosecution if we were to disclose that. I don't even remember all the details, but eventually it came out. One or all 3 of our news organizations reported on that. Then there was the Iran-Contra affair. There was the Pan Am Flight 103 bombing in '88, the first Gulf War, World Trade Center 1. I mentioned missile defense. I mentioned China. Maybe China was one area that I've been focusing on, and I got interested in that. I went to the Pentagon for a background briefing. I was doing something on the Chinese military, and at that time, the Defense Intelligence Agency would actually provide you with a briefing that you would attribute to a defense official or something. And I had this briefing, and during the briefing, somebody came in and said, "The general would like to see you." And I said, "Okay." And the general was the director of the agency, and he sat me down and he said, "Well, Bill, I want to tell you something. I want to tell you that China is not a threat." And I said, "Well, okay, why do you think that?" And he went on to explain his whole views on that because of their statements and all these things. And it was pretty amazing to me, but it got me thinking about this because I kept hearing this theme everywhere I went in government. China's not a threat. China's not a threat. I said, well, why do we say that they're not a threat? I mean, they're a communist dictatorship. They have nuclear weapons. They have missiles that can hit us. But why are they so aggressively insisting it's not a threat? And that ended up becoming a book that I did called The China Threat, interestingly enough, which kind of highlighted all of these issues. And it came out right around the time of a big Chinese nuclear spy scandal, which is another good story that we had. The New York Times won a Pulitzer Prize for it, reporting on a Los Alamos scientist. And then they repudiated their own reporting by saying that it was bad, and then the guy got off because he was Chinese American. Anyway, that was a whole story. The FBI botched the investigation. Let me just conclude with a few comments about the technical aspects of writing. That's once you get all of your facts together and you're ready to put the story together, a lot of times you don't have a lot of time to do that. I mean, you can rely on the editors to backstop you and help you fill in the gaps, but you really have to figure out what the information is, what's the most important part of that information, and a lot of times a good method to do for that is to think in terms of headlines. What's the headline of the story, And if you can put it in in a few words, and this is very relevant to today's Twitter, and that's one of the new media that I've learned to rely on is Twitter. I don't follow people who tell me they're going for a hamburger or a yoga class, but I have a lot of really good news sources, and they're all over the world. It can be the Israeli Defense Forces spokesman, and they'll tweet when they arrest Palestinians. It could be some of the blogs that break stories about what's going on inside Pakistan. But you think in terms of a headline, and in Twitter terms, it's 140 characters minus the shortened URL. And then, of course, the lead of the story. You need to have a compelling lead. And you want to be able to write very clearly and concisely and tell the reader right up front what you're going to tell them in the rest of the story. And, it may sound like something that's easy, but it's definitely not easy to do. But always try to write very clear and concise leads. And then, of course, there's the basic rules of writing. Use active verbs over passive, prefer shorter to longer, simple to complex, and but most importantly, understand your topic. It's often been compared that newspaper reporters, when they write a story, they become instant experts. The way one person described it is, it's like for every story you have a bathtub and you fill it up with information that you need for that story, and then you put all the pieces, you learn about it, you put all the pieces together, and when you're done, you pull the plug and the information goes down the drain, and then you fill them up for the next story. So it's kind of like that process to get all of your information. Keep asking questions. That I think it was Judith Miller who described it in intelligence terms. In the intelligence world, they have INTs for intelligence. They have HUMINT for human intelligence. They have SIGINT for signals intelligence, and they have a whole bunch of others. But in the news business, they call it AskInt. In other words, you ask the questions, and that will produce the intelligence that you need for your stories. And as I said earlier, that's really an amazing, amazing thing. If you ask enough people, it's almost like being a door-to-door salesman. If you've ever had to sell things door-to-door, you know that if you keep knocking on doors, eventually you're going to sell something. I mean, that's pretty much the way it works. And in Washington, if you ask long enough, pretty much obviously there are some places doors that won't be open, but you'll get a lot of information just from asking. It's like I say, it's a very unruly and competitive business. But one of the things that makes us an advantage here is that we have absolutely the most open society in the world. As Jamie mentioned in his remarks, it's really amazing that you can walk through the Pentagon. I mean, I can remember doing that too, walking past the Secretary of Defense's office, and he'd be in there working, and he'd have his personnel everywhere. But because we're open, people like to come to reporters. Oftentimes, reporters are the last line of their defense. They've gone to their administrator. They may have gone to Congress. They may even have gone to the courts, and they didn't get any relief for whatever problem they see. So then they'll go to reporters. Oftentimes it's not always a story. Sometimes it is. And so reporters often get volunteers, as I think Brian mentioned. But try to develop the sources. You go to conferences. You talk to former officials. Ask those questions. And if someone doesn't know, you ask, the next question is, well, can you tell me someone that does know? And then they can give you a referral. So a lot of think tanks in town often provide good kind of source things, but it's a source-intensive business. It's a very social business. It requires good people skills. There's a lot of mutual back-scratching, and by that I mean, I've developed sources by going to the State Department and doing an on-the-record interview with someone from the Oceanic Bureau talking about the environment and so on. And that has ended up producing very good sources, people who can be sources of information for other stories. They call that in the news business a beat sweetener story, something that will help enhance your ability to do things. And the more you write on a certain subject, you also will attract additional information from other people who might contact you. And of course, now with digital technology, a lot of people will contact you and say, hey, you're exactly right. And by the way, did you know about this? A lot of times, some stories don't work out, and oftentimes reporters just get totally blown away that their story didn't work out or something didn't happen. Don't worry about it. The way the news business is, there's always another story. If one story doesn't work out, you can be assured with 100% confidence that there'll be other stories down the road. Okay, I think at that point I'll stop and we'll open up the questions. Do you want to?
I just want to say, before we take questions, I'll make this really quick, but just a couple of points. I know a lot of what we've been talking about seems like it's from the Jurassic era of journalism. We're telling you war stories from the 70s, 80s, and maybe into the 90s. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how things have changed to sort of bring it back to today, and then we'll open it up to your questions. When I started as a correspondent at CNN, of course, CNN made its real reputation with the 1991 Persian Gulf War and its coverage of that. And it was pretty amazing back then because we could actually get live pictures from the battlefield using these portable earth stations that we developed called flyaways, which was basically a big satellite dish, and in just 21 cases of equipment and only 5 people to operate it, we could actually go live from pretty much anywhere where we could hit a satellite. Flash forward to 2008 when I left CNN. My last report I did from Iraq, I was traveling by myself. I did it with my little MacBook Pro with the web camera that's in the MacBook and a little portable device called a BGAN, or Broadband Global Area Network. It's basically a satellite access to the internet. Through that, I connected my computer to the internet, and just like you would do something over your webcam on your MacBook, I was able to broadcast a live report from Baghdad back to CNN, and it looked pretty good. I actually have a clip of this on my blog if anybody's interested in seeing how it looked and how I put it together. But when I first started at CNN, I was a television correspondent, a network television correspondent, and I had producers, and when I went out with a camera crew and a sound technician, and when I was back in the bureau, I had makeup artists and producers helping me. By the time I left CNN, I was pretty much doing everything myself. Writing for the web, filing for radio, taking pictures, shooting and editing video, as I said, doing my own live report directly from my computer. And as I mentioned earlier this morning, the rise of the internet and all the competition changed the product that CNN was creating because they no longer had to provide a lot of the routine information. They just wanted to concentrate on certain hot stories. But it also changed the way we covered things. So, for instance, like Catherine Herridge, who mentioned how important it was to go down to Guantanamo and witness the cases, I too wanted to go to Guantanamo to cover one of the first military commissions of the trial of Salim Hamdan, who is the man accused of being Osama bin Laden's driver and bodyguard. I felt it was a really important case. I wanted to be there, but CNN was not interested in spending the money to send, a crew and producers and satellites and all that. So, armed with this new technology of being able to essentially do things myself, I made the pitch that I should just go by myself. Doesn't cost CNN anything because I was under salary and didn't get overtime, so they paid me the same whether I'm sitting at the Pentagon or whether I'm sitting in a courtroom in Guantanamo. But it did make it more difficult to cover because I had to do not just normally I would just go down there, I would sit in the courtroom, watch everything, in case anybody threw a paper plane or something that was going to be significant, and then I'd come out and report it. Well, because I'm now doing all the technical stuff as well. I'm setting up the camera, getting a little, acquiring the satellite, laying all the cables, dealing with all the logistics. I'm sort of shortchanging the time that I'm spending in the courtroom. Plus, another dynamic has happened in that CNN is not as interested in the story as I am. I think it's a pretty interesting, fascinating story, but it's a complex legal issue about to what extent the right these terrorist suspects have rights and how it's being handled in the court. It's kind of a complex issue. So one day, and this is just illustrative of how the business changed, one day I hear that they're going to allow the pool photographers to go take a picture of the cells where they keep the high-value al-Qaeda suspects. It's an empty cell, but it's representative of the kind of accommodations they've had, because they're trying to counter the impression that somehow the conditions there are inhumane. So I say, hey, I want to go along. They say, so look, this is only for photographers. It's not really for reporters. It's just so they can get some pictures. I said, hey, I'm a photographer too. I'm not just a reporter. I'm everything. They said, okay, yeah, well, you can go, but you have to wait till the real photographers go through, and then we'll give you a minute. You can go in. So I go in to this little cell, and I've got maybe, I literally have like 2 minutes, and I've got my little video camera, and I hold the camera up. I'm holding it up, and I'm looking, and I just talking to the camera, I'm saying, like, this is a cell where they hold the high-value suspects, and I'm kind of turning around this, and you can see behind me, it's got a window, but you can't see out of it, and here's what they get. And I turn the camera on, and I edit this into a little piece, and I send it to CNN. Now, I'm having a hard time getting on the air with the story, with the complex legal story about the military commissions and the trial of Hamdan. But this little piece of video, which basically doesn't really break any journalistic ground, this is really highly promotable. You know, this is, so it's like now you're hearing like, tonight, a CNN exclusive, inside al-Qaeda cell, where the worst of the worst are being held. We take, in a CNN exclusive, we take you inside. This piece ran like 16 times, which is sort of illustrative of the kind of the trend of how things are going. This was there was nothing wrong with the piece. It was kind of interesting. I wouldn't have done it if I didn't think it was interesting, but it really struck me how that kind of a story, which was much more fluffy, much more sort of lend itself to being hyped and sensationalized, was much more appealing to the producers who were putting their shows together on CNN than the more complex story that I was having trouble. I did get to do the other story as well. It just wasn't as easy to get that one on the air. So I want to leave time for questions, so I'll stop.
Go ahead, let's start.
We ask that you wait for the microphone before you ask a question, because we are recording this. So if you could just raise your hand and we'll bring a microphone.
Hi, my question is, have you ever covered a story that was so sensitive in nature that you received threats of some kind, that you were afraid for your life, or perhaps been in an area where you were covering a story and you thought that your life might be in danger?
I'll let Jamie do. Personally, I have not. I think that the most threats that I've received were from the CIA. They once threatened to fire a cruise missile at my desk at the Washington Times. I reported on something critical about their operations. I've been criticized by the Russian government. They call me a tool of the CIA, which was unusual. The Chinese government once did a piece where they listed the top 10 anti-China experts in the world, and they made me #1. Wow! I tell you I'm not anti-China, I'm anti-Chinese government. But I've never really felt threatened. Maybe did we turn it on? Are we on? There we go. Yeah, I've never really felt threatened by anything. I've been in some dicey situations overseas, but nothing, nothing really life-threatening. You probably have.
Yeah. Well, I've never been threatened because of anything I've reported. I have, been in situations that were, dangerous, particularly in retrospect, not the least of which was on the Pentagon on September 11th, where apparently somebody tried to, attack the building with an airplane. And part of that is because of the relationship that I had with the people I covered, in that, I don't think anybody thought I was out to get anyone. I had worked really hard to establish a reputation of somebody who was really trying to get the story right, and if somebody, I think, thought I didn't quite capture it right, there wasn't a lot of animosity there. But because I was in the military, I covered the military, I was in lots of situations where things happened. I was on a helicopter that accidentally landed too close to the North Korean border. I was in a helicopter that went down because a hydraulic line burst. I was in Somalia when a bunch of mortar rounds went right over our head. And I was on the plane that that crashed and killed Ron Brown, the Commerce Secretary, the day before his plane crashed. He flew into the same place we flew in the day before, but when his plane landed, it crashed inside of a mountain. So, I've had some sort of near-death experiences, but nothing that was directed at me personally.
Chairman Woolsey talked about how if you're interested in getting a government job, sometimes it helps to just get your foot in the door, and there's some opportunity for sideways mobility. For us here who are interns trying to enter the field of journalism in particular, I'd be interested to know how each of you kind of got your start and where you are today and covering the topics you're covering.
Okay. In my case, I think my first journalism job was with a sister paper to the Washington Times called the New York City Tribune. And I think it was back in like 1979 where I covered the what was known as the FBI trial, and it was the end of the Watergate era trial of Mark Felt and Edward S. Miller, and they were both convicted of illegal break-ins. Turned out later that Mark Felt happened to be Deep Throat, the famous Watergate source. Nobody knew it at the time, but I kind of, I think Watergate was a pivotal event for a lot of people in my generation, and that's kind of inspired me to be a reporter, to be able to break big stories. I joined the Times in '85. I came on board when they named a new editor, Arno de Borkrov, who I knew a little bit, and he basically gave me my start and kind of protected me. And that was kind of my career. Yeah, I think that's how I started. It's definitely not an easy job environment out there, but I think that there will be journalism jobs. It's just going to be, striving to be really excellent. And with the new media and proliferation of new media, you can set yourself apart by learning and showing your reporting skills online, and then that will capture somebody's attention.
Yeah, there's really two parts to this question. One is, how did I get my excellent job? And one is, how do you get your excellent job? And I'll try to make this as short as possible. I went to journalism school, got a journalism degree. You don't need a journalism degree to be a journalist. What you do need is some sort of experience that you can keep building on, and journalism school does give you some of that, some practical skills that you can use to try to get that first job. Once you get a job, you learn most of the stuff you need on the job. There is a value of journalism school, though, in things like studying law of mass communications, ethics, things that maybe you don't have time to discuss in the newsroom. In broadcasting, and most of my career has been in broadcasting, there's really two routes that you can take. You either start small in a big market or at a big organization like CNN. You start as some lowly, what they call them, VJs, that they call them at CNN. Or you go to a small market and you start big there and you keep moving to bigger and bigger markets. Both have its disadvantages, because the biggest obstacle you have, and it's true, it's just like anything else, you do have to get your foot in the door. Internships are a good way to do that. The challenge you always have is always convincing somebody that you can do something other than what you're doing right now. People tend to see, if you take a job in the tape library at CNN, they say, well, he's just a tape librarian, you've got to constantly convince people that you can do something other than what you're doing. So, when I started in radio. I was off the air. I had to convince them I could be on the air. And one universal thing that will happen everywhere is at some point someone will tell you, you just really don't have what it takes and you should consider doing something else. Almost everybody has had that experience where someone says, you're really not cut out for this. So when I was off the air, I had to get on the air in radio. When I was in radio, I couldn't convince anybody I could do television. When I got into television, I ended up doing feature stories, and they didn't think I couldn't convince them I could do hard news. Then I got to cover the Pentagon, so I did hard news. Then I had to convince. Then I went back to radio. Then I had to convince people I could do commercial radio or public radio, which is different. And so you're constantly sort of facing that thing. But one of the things is you just keep at it until everybody else gives up. Now these days it's also different, because in the old days, you'd put together a clip file if you were a newspaper, or you'd put together a tape reel if you were trying to get into broadcast journalism, and now it's all about online. If you haven't already, you need a blog or a website that showcases your work, that as you do things, and even whether it's for school or whether it's intern or whether it's something you did for free, you can showcase your talents. I teach as an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland. I teach multimedia journalism now, in which I teach creating videos, slideshows, and that sort of thing for the web, because that's what all reporters need to be able to do these days. And it's a great way to, these days if you go apply for a job, what they want to see is, they want to be able to go to your website and see what you've done, and they want to be able to see that you understand new media, that your Twitter feed is displayed on your site and all that stuff, and then you're just competing with everybody else.
One quick story. When I first started in '85 at the Times, the guy who sat next to me was an old reporter. I mean, he must have been in his late 70s. He smoked like a chimney. He was constantly coughing. I thought he was going to die. He got his job back in the late 40s because he was a reporter in Atlanta, Georgia, and there was a hotel fire, and he ran inside the hotel fire and got the guest register and went to Associated Press, and they hired him on the spot. Yes.
I would love if you could both speak to developing relationships with sources and how you maintain enough independence from them, but yet develop trust, and then also when you have to burn sources. Have you had to burn sources?
I've never burned a source. And there might be one exception there. I think maybe very early on, there was some professor who went on the record with the Washington Post, but would only say the same thing to me on background, and I basically burned him. I used his name, but that was it. That was the only time. I've always observed a very strict rule about protecting sources. As I said, protecting your sources and having a reputation for protecting your sources is crucial to being able to develop more. So I was always very stringent about that. I've been friends with some of my sources. I've played sports with some of them. Others have. It's been very, professional, arm's length. It's been, they want something out. If it's news, we'll report on it. If it's not as much news, but it's still marginally newsy, yeah, I'll report it. Okay, maybe that will then lead to a bigger story. I mean, you have to, weigh it, and you have to be careful. That would be my advice.
Well, I've never burned a source, but I wouldn't say that I wouldn't burn a source. I might. Because I don't think these rules are inviolate. They generally work really well, but if you burn somebody, you have to decide what the consequences are and whether there's a greater good. And I'll just give you a quick example. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Michael Hastings profile of General Stanley McChrystal that ended up getting McChrystal fired. And there's a lot of discussion because a lot of what he reported is typically off the record and not for reporting, and that generated a discussion about whether reporters are too cozy with these sources, that they're willing to put too much stuff off the record to protect their relationship with their sources. And so when I was discussing this in an academic sense, one of my friends argued, well, if it's off the record, then you can never report it under any circumstances. Well, I'm not sure that's true, because you could decide that you were going to. And I said, let's take an example. Let's say I'm traveling with a four-star general, and we're having an off-the-record discussion. We've agreed it's off the record, and we're just going to have a beer and chat about how things are going. And let's say he referred to President Obama using the N-word. I'm just making this up. But it's off the record. Well, now, I might decide that this is so egregious, that this is such a disrespectful thing, and it violates the Uniform Code of Military Justice and shows contempt for our Commander-in-Chief. I might decide that I can't keep that off the record. I would probably go to the general and say, look, what you said last night, I can't honor, I can't keep that off the record. And he might say, well, if you report this, you'll be violating. And I'd say, well, you do what you have to do, and I'll do what I have to do. So it's not, it's not a federal law. It's not even a moral thing. It's really an agreement between two people, which gets back to what is the relationship? How do you develop sources? Your relationship with sources is very much a marriage of convenience. It's not that they love you because you're such a great person or that you respect. It's like you need each other. You're using them, and they're using you. And what you just want is for that mutual using to be based on accuracy and honesty. And there's a process that there's this sort of courting that goes on between you and the source. They want to know that if they give you information, that you're going to handle it responsibly, you're going to provide the context, that you're going to give them a fair shake, not necessarily that you're going to do a story that's favorable to them, but just that they're going to get a fair shake, and that you're smart enough to understand it and you're going to put it in the proper context. That's what they're looking for generally. And by the same token, what you're looking from them is that they're giving you accurate information, that while they might be providing their view is, they're not giving you spin, and that what they told you turns out to be true later. And at every point when they give you information, at some point you find out if it's actually true or not. Sometimes it's the next day, sometimes it's a week, sometimes it's a year later. So over time, you calibrate what you get from each person. You decide, the term reliable sources means that these people have been reliable. What they've told you in the past has panned out. The spin has been, either straightforward and honest, or it's not there. And by the same token, and so over time you develop a relationship with people that you feel you can trust because they've been reliable in the past, and they feel they can trust you. And they may just totally want to make sure they have some friends in the media, It's difficult. Source management is the hardest thing because people are constantly leaving. People are in a position where you develop a really great source, they get to be a 4-star general, and then they're gone. They're out of then they've got no access to information. Same thing with the reporters. They have a great relationship with the reporter, and with the exception of a few people like Bill who are on the beat forever, you've got a great relationship, then they're gone, they're covering something else. So you constantly have to be working on it. It's probably the most labor-intensive part of your job, is just managing your sources.
Yeah, and it also brings up the issue of anonymous sources, which we really didn't discuss, but we definitely should. I think there was a case a number of years ago that the Washington Post put in place a rule that said no more anonymous sources. Everything has to be attributable to someone on the record. Well, it didn't last very long at all. Because it was just too hard to compete. But the government has decided that for whatever reason they want to give out information, but they don't want it attributed directly to a specific person, or in some cases a specific agency. And it's created a lot of problems. The purists in the news business say we should never use it. We should fight against the use of anonymous sources. My view is if the information is accurate and can be attributed in a way that is satisfy minimum standards from this agency, from this person with access to it, then I'm okay with it. And I've built my career on it, and I've tried to err on the side of caution. If we really need two sources of information when we write a story, but as is the case with many of the rules in journalism, you break most of them. I think journalistic rules is kind of an oxymoron. You follow the rules, but for example, if one of the sources happens to be the Deputy Secretary of State, you're going to bend the rules because that's fairly credible. Now, if the Deputy Secretary of State gives you bad information, that will be your loss, and it's something that you really, really have to be careful of, because newspapers and news organizations live and die on their credibility. And if you get them wrong, the New York Times can get a few more wrong than the Washington Times and still survive. And of course, they've had their problems too. There's been the Jason Blair scandal, and we've had the Kelley scandal, where you have reporters fabricating things, and then they try to tighten up on the anonymous source rules. Generally, the levels go, if you're on the record, everything the person says can be attributed. If it's on background, it can't be attributed by name, and then you have to really be clear on the rules. Can you say that this is from a State Department official? Can you say it's from a Defense Department official? Sometimes that's okay. Sometimes they don't want that. I'm not sure the reason. Jamie probably has a better sense for why they don't want certain information attributed. It's usually based on their own internal politics. And then there's the category called off the record. And off the record is what I try to avoid the most. I remember many years ago, the CIA opened its counterterrorism center, and they had all these TV sets and computers, and it was a big deal. And we got out there, a group of reporters, and they told us it was off the record. And I said, wait a minute. I said, I'm not out here to see your new TV sets. I'm here to write a story. And so they had to have a big meeting about whether they could change the ground rules from off the record to on background. And they eventually agreed, because I was ready to walk out. I don't want to do stuff that I can't use for my story. Now, what does off the record mean? That means that the information that person gives you can't be reported. Does that mean that you can't take that information and go to someone else and say, hey, what do you know about this? And if they tell you that, does that mean that you're violating? I don't know the answer to that, and I don't want to know the answer. So in other words, there's a certain ambiguity. Anytime any person, government official, imparts information to you with caveats, you try your best to abide by the rules, but remember that anytime they release information, they release it to you, they could release it to someone else.
Yeah, I would just say one more thing about off the record. I wrote a piece about off the record and what it means for the American Journalism Review, which you could Google if you wanted to see it. But essentially, this is my definition of off the record. Off the record means not reporting in any form unless it's really, really good. And I only say that half facetiously because, as in the example I gave earlier, we could be off the record if it turns out it's a big enough deal. The only way anything's, first of all, nothing's off the record in a group setting, because somebody's going to tell somebody, it's going to get out. The only way things can be off the record if it's between two people and they trust each other, particularly if one of them is dead, then you're pretty safe. But it has to be two people, and it's a matter of trust between those two people. Beyond that, once you're in sort of a group situation, like McChrystal was traveling and stuff off the record, it's kind of off the record, but if something, if we're in an off the record situation and something bad happens, it's going to get reported. So it's and if you're in a conversation with somebody and they say, look, in order to explain that to you, I'm going to have to go off the record. That's your signal to say, no, let's just stay on the record a while longer. And then you can decide, you don't want to accept anything off the record, because now you're going to be, because even if you do get it someplace else, if you tell me something off the record and then Bill tells me the same thing on the record and I report it, or he tells me on background, my source is going to think I burned them anyway. So it's to be avoided really on both sides, because it just doesn't work very well. Oh, and on anonymous sources, I not only am okay with them, I think they're absolutely essential. I think a lot of really great journalism would never have happened if it had not been for anonymous sources. I think they're key.
Oh, we have one over here?
Yeah, right here. I think my question would be best prefaced in saying that I come from a military family, and then when my dad was stationed in Camp Pendleton, he went to Iraq, and this was early 2007. This is when IEDs were still wreaking havoc. A general held a meeting for military families, kind of giving us the lowdown of what was going on over there, and the only thing is that before I went to that meeting, I read, I think it was just in like Yahoo News feed or something like this, I read about MRAPs. And in the article it said something like, this still hasn't been implemented yet, it's, got contractual problems, that kind of stuff. So I talked with the general basically about that, being like, when are these things going to be implemented? And he promptly told me that, if he ever finds the person who leaked this story or who reported it in a bar, that this is going to be a very bad day for that person. So my question is kind of two-part in that, something like that, should it be out in the general public knowledge? What good does it do for the general public to be reading these things when it's not really fully implemented by the military yet? And also, if I was a reporter and I had this story and I was uncomfortable with reporting this because of these certain things, how would I go about not reporting that?
Well, so the general is upset because the program to send these mine-resistant armored vehicles to Iraq wasn't up and ready to go yet it was being reported on by the press. But the problem, and this is a story where the press, I think, did a fairly good job, because the problem was the Pentagon, and particularly under the Rumsfeld administration, was very slow to acknowledge that maybe these expensive but much more armored vehicles would be of use in Iraq. They were under the delusion that the war was winding down, that by the time they got these things built and sent over there, they wouldn't really need them anymore. They'd be spending a lot of money on something that wasn't going to make that much of a difference. And it wasn't until Secretary Gates got in and sort of lit a fire under them that they really ramped up the MRAP protection. I mean, this is a case where the press, I think, reported accurately that the military, the Marines in particular, but the Army as well, were just very, very slow to put in place technology that was potentially going to save the lives of American troops. That's what the press ought to be doing. And if I met the general in a bar, he'd be a very bad day for him. Well, maybe not physically, but I would definitely give him a piece of my mind. Yeah.
I think his thought was that if it was not so implemented in strategic-wise as far as the military is concerned, could that not be taken by the enemy as sort of a countermeasure?
Yeah, well, that would be really dumb logic. But you see a lot of that in the military, where they're so insulated, they're so thinking just about their own narrow little problem and how this could possibly, that they're missing the big picture. That's why we have civilian control of the military. You know, the old expression that the war is too important to be left to the generals. That's why you have to have a civilian leader come in and crack the whip over these guys, because they're in this mindset. They planned things so long, they have budgets for things. If they got to move money for MRAPs, they're going to have to take it away from something else. They get so locked into this thinking. You know, that's exactly the kind of flawed military thinking that results in disaster. And you think, well, how do these smart people who got to be generals make such dumb decisions? Well, of course, the civilians can make dumb decisions too. But that's just an example. They were just way too slow to recognize the problem. They were too enamored of their scenario of how they thought this was going to go out. They thought the war was ending, they were going to be leaving. You know, they thought they were only going to have 30,000 troops in Iraq, 6 months after. Well, it turned out they were wrong, and they needed to adapt. And one of the keys to good policy is to recognize when things have changed and to adapt to it. And of course, once we send more MRAPs over there, then the insurgents adapt to that too. So it goes back and forth.
You had a question here.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on the leadership style from Caspar Weinberger up to former Secretary Robert Gates, and how would that affect the acquiring of information, whether that be confidential information or public source information? And could you touch base on the China threat to the United States and their spread in South and Central America? Thank you.
Why don't you do the second?
Well, I wasn't there for Weinberger, but I started with Cheney and went through Gates, so I won't be able to comment. In terms of the relationship, who's in charge in the civilians and the flow of information in the Pentagon, I didn't see a lot of change. I mean, they all come in, they all complain about leaks, they all claim they're going to crack down, they all scare people at some point. There's 24,000 people in the Pentagon. Somebody's always talking. They can't stop anything. When Secretary Gates put out a policy, wrote a policy about tightening up information and stopping leaks, that leaked within a half an hour. The policy leaked within a half an hour. Each of the defense secretaries had a different personality. Probably the least effective one when I was there was Les Aspin. Among the most effective was William Perry, who had this sort of mathematician's brain and could reduce things to their essential arguments and carry the day. I think Rumsfeld would have been seen as a great defense secretary had the Iraq War gone differently. I think in many respects he gets a bad rap. He was a lot of fun to cover. He did a lot of things very controversial, but he also, much like Gates, took a firm control of the Pentagon, which is what the civilians are supposed to do. Gates is interesting because he's the firingest defense secretary ever. Woolsey was complaining about nobody, having a controversy and nobody getting fired. Gates doesn't let a controversy go by without firing somebody, whether they're responsible or not, because it plays very well on Capitol Hill. People love it, shows accountability. Gates is a very smart and interesting guy. His CIA background. He famously said, the press is not the enemy. He made a big speech about that. I actually framed that and put it outside my office to remind people that we're not the enemy. Although, as I would point out to people, actually, he was wrong about that. We are the enemy. Well, we're not the enemy of the government. We're frenemies. We're frenemies. I'll leave you to talk about the China threat.
Yeah, you didn't mention Bill Cohen, who was kind of our poet defense secretary for a while there. We traveled with him on a number of occasions. China's a big issue. It's a growing problem. There's a debate right now. For many years, the conventional policy wisdom was, let's not do anything to adjust our policies to China's military buildup because we could then create a China threat. They called it the self-fulfilling prophecy. It was done by a Harvard guy named Joe Nye, who was in the Pentagon. And so really you had a situation where we couldn't respond to what they were doing. So they would shoot down a satellite, which is like a really bad sign if you're in the... if you shoot down 23 or so of the U.S. military satellites, you're basically going to put them out of business. I mean, that's a fact that it's a very unpleasant fact that the military doesn't want. The Chinese shot down a satellite in January of 2007, and now they're building an anti-ship ballistic missile that's designed to attack aircraft carriers, but there's reluctance to talk about how to counter that because then again, they want to create this China threat, but for many in the military, especially at the, not the high levels, but the mid levels, they're starting to say, look, we got a big problem. And if we don't, because it takes so long to develop weapon systems to counter these things, if we don't start doing something now, we're going to be in big trouble in 5 or 10 years. What's going on in China today? You basically have this nuclear-armed communist dictatorship that, about 30 years ago abandoned the economics of Marxism-Leninism, but not the politics of it. In fact, their system is basically a Soviet-style system. I mean, it's a dictatorship of the proletariat with a collective of about 7 people. They have power ministries, they have a strong military, and they have this socialist economy that's booming. So they're trying to make themselves a model for other places in the world. They're moving into Africa, buying up countries, buying up resources. They're using massive amounts of resources. So there's going to be kind of an emerging global conflict or competition for resources. And I think that's playing out most immediately in the South China Sea with recent tensions there. You have the Chinese squaring off with the Vietnamese over some disputed islands. The Chinese are saying that this is the entire sea is our core interest, and there's a lot of oil and gas resources there, which are Vietnam and the Philippines and other states are vying for trying to get access to those. So it's a big problem. There's a big debate. It hasn't been resolved. Just recently, the Pentagon announced what they call a new concept. They call it the air-sea battle concept. It sounds very obtuse, but basically what it is, it's directed against the Chinese, and it's trying to develop better communications and interoperability between the Navy excuse me, between the Navy and the Air Force. And so that's one thing that they're doing. Under Rumsfeld, they had something called the Hedge Strategy, which hedge meaning to bet on both sides. And so they were saying, look, we think China will develop as a peaceful power, but we're not sure. They won't tell us why they're building anti-satellite weapons and anti-ship ballistic missiles. So we need to develop capabilities to be ready in case they want to threaten our allies in Asia. Okay, how are we doing time-wise here? We got time for a couple more questions, I think. Sure. Stephen.
So an issue we had like a week or two ago was when I spoke to an expert that you were cautious about. And so my question is just dealing with experts like that. We heard from the expert side of the field that you have to be careful about who you talk to depending on how long they've been out of there. So how do you feel about using sources from think tanks and other fields, especially because there's so many of them with so many different points of view and possible different conflicting interests on their parts, as we discussed?
Sure. The use of the Washington expert. This is a kind of a journalistic device in a lot of ways to really try to provide what Jamie called the context to a story. Experts at think tanks can give you the what it all means quote for your story to kind of put into context what the news story is all about. And I think it's useful to kind of understand the political leanings of the various think tanks in Washington. And in my view, everything in Washington is tinged with politics, no matter what they tell you about something being purely objective. If you look at who their board members are, if you look at who their funding is, if you can find that, it will give you a sense of where they come from. In a lot of cases, the idea of a think tank used to be that this was where people from the opposite party would go when they were out of government. And then when their administration came in, then they would go back into government. So they were kind of like holding tanks for a lot of officials. So I think that's kind of the tradition there. So in the political perspective, I think you'd have to say the Brookings Institution kind of is on the liberal the liberal side. There are some newer democratic-oriented Center for American Progress and those that kind of are on to the left of the political spectrum. CSIS, Center for Strategic International Studies, used to be directly part of Georgetown. It's separate. They used to be somewhat to right of center. They now maybe somewhat a little bit left, but fairly center. The American Enterprise Institute is considered more neoconservative. The Herridge Foundation across the street, they're more of a traditionalist, more economic-oriented conservatism. So it's useful to try and understand that. I think you can, if you were to just kind of search for some of these think tanks and some of these people, you could find out what they may have said about other issues, and that will give you a sense of where they're coming from.
Yeah, I would just say about going to experts for your stories, it's the last place you should go. And I don't mean you shouldn't go there, I just mean you should be the last place. In other words, sometimes you see reporters who, let's say they're supposed to do a story about MRAPs to Iraq. Well, they don't know anything about MRAPs to Iraq. So the first thing they do is they call up some think tank, the Institute for Study of MRAPs or something, and they call some, because they don't know anything about it, they interview the expert, he tells them what the story is, and then they sort of pursue that story. That's the backwards way to do it. I didn't use a lot of experts in my reporting because I tended to just focus on what the facts were. Here's what the need for MRAPs was, here's what the Army says, here's what somebody... But, eventually you get to the point where you could have a line in your story that essentially says, critics say this is bad, but supporters say it's not so bad. And sometimes you need somebody to say that. So so after you've done the reporting and you kind of know what the sides are, you might want to find someone who can articulate that. So you don't have to just say, critics say the Obama administration is wrong on his Israeli policy, but other supporters say he's doing just the right thing. So you find somebody who's going to put those into words, somebody who's smart, who knows the issue, but by the time you go to them, you already know sort of like what part of the story you need to sort of fill out, and that's how I tended to use the experts. I would develop people who I thought were smart, who pretty much knew things, and every once in a while they'd surprise me and have an opinion that was significantly different than what I thought. But I would use them to just sort of buttress the reporting I'd already done. I just think the mistake that too many people make is they just call, it's the lazy way to report. You don't know anything about missile defense, so you call the, somebody who studies missile defense, and whatever they tell you, that's kind of what your story, how your story goes. And I just think that's the backwards way to do it.
Okay.
You touched upon a little bit about doing everything yourself, and I just wondered what your guys' thoughts were upon like mobile reporting and just basically getting things out on like laptops and on cell phones and things like that, like having the ability to get information out right away if you really need to spread that out.
Yeah, well, life is full of little trade-offs, and also the world is changing, and you can't bemoan. It's like I always worry about just sitting around the newsroom sounding like I was some dinosaur. In my day, we used to go out and cover the news, not like you whippersnappers today. Because I think that's what we sound like sometimes. We start talking about how we did things in the old days. It's life, and you have to deal with it. It is harder to do certain kinds of stories. It's great for certain things, like if a tornado hits and wipes out Joplin, Missouri, the mobile reporting can be much faster and give you a much faster idea. If it's a complex story like Woolsey was talking about, the middle ground of people who are non-violent, it's a contextual story, then this kind of rushed reporting doesn't serve very well. But the reality is we got a mix of all of that, and hopefully there'll still be some news organizations who are taking the time to do complicated stories in a way that really explains them. A really good example of that, by the way, was off the national security issue, but the recent statement from the World Health Organization that cell phones may cause cancer, in the same sense that you may win the lottery. It could happen. Most of the initial reporting on that was really shallow, didn't do anything to help you understand the science behind it, but eventually some people caught up. Time magazine did a great piece in their current issue on cancer, really sort of explaining what the science is and what that was all about. But you don't see a lot of that on a complicated story like that until usually some time has passed.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. Who wants to do the last one? Okay, you are.
I'm curious how, I have the chance this summer to do some covering of just foreign affairs, intelligence, security issues, and I think a lot of times it's just kind of jumping into the field for the first time here. I feel like I'm kind of picking up the leftovers of, what people who are actually in the field are actually covering, and I'm just trying to kind of pick through news stories. And, a lot of us, I think, are here interns and we're young, and we haven't had a chance to develop sources with Pentagon officials and things like that. So what's your advice for someone who's young, just trying to kind of get their nose in here at the very start and find something that's actually unique, has a unique point of view, and just not something that's being reported over and over already?
Well, one advantage you have is that you are young and you do have a unique point of view. I think all of us as reporters have had this experience of going into an area where everybody else has been covering it for years and you're brand new, and suddenly you see something that hasn't struck any of the people there because they just see it all the time. So part of it is just keeping your eyes open, just thinking about things in different ways, realizing that you may bring different things to it. You do run the risk of, and this is the other thing you see, is that every time a new reporter comes on the beat, somebody discovers a story that everybody else has reported, and reports it as if it's brand new. I just saw, I think it was Diane Sawyer on ABC did a story about the plane, the Doomsday Plane. Did you see this story? Well, I think Bill mentioned that we fly on these planes that refuel in the air. One of the planes we fly it's the E-4B. It used to be the Doomsday Plane. It's not really a Doomsday Plane anymore, but it's a flying command center, and the Defense Secretary likes to fly it because it's a 747 with no windows and a big hump on the top where they have communications equipment. It's a very cool plane. And so the first time you go on it, probably like the first time you walk up the driveway of the White House, you're kind of impressed. But every once in a while, a new reporter comes on the plane, they've never seen it before, and it ends up with a story about the plane. So it's kind of a joke after a while. And sure enough, Diane Sawyer went to interview Gates, flew on the plane. Next thing you know, there's a feature on ABC about the Doomsday Plane. And it's always slightly hyped. It always makes it sound like this plane is, ready to take to the skies in the event of a nuclear war. And in fact, that mission is kind of gone away. Technically, it's all true, but it's they love telling the story. It sort of feeds into the legend, and so you are sort of susceptible to that as the new kid on the block. But also, you can sometimes just have a fresh perspective and see things and connect dots in a way that people haven't by just keeping your mind open. The one piece of advice that I would give you, and I think this is true, whether you're reporting a story or whether you're a news organization trying to come up with an identity, is don't pay much attention to what everybody else is doing. Just think for yourself. Now, the temptation is, well, these guys have been, these network reporters, they've been doing this for years. I need to sort of see what they're doing. I can learn from them. Well, that's true to an extent, but you almost always do better if, like Bill was talking about, you go to something and you're trying to figure out what the news is. Well, if you go to the AP wire and see, well, let's see what AP led with. Oh, okay, I'm going to go with their story. You're much better off just never reading the wires, never looking at what your competition does. Maybe after you've done your story, you might take a look, and just thinking for yourself. And you develop that ability to just think for yourself. And yeah, you're going to miss a few things, and sometimes, but 90% of the time, you will have better original take on something by just figuring it out yourself than spending too much time looking over your shoulder at everybody else.
Yeah, just quickly from go for those stories where there's some type of conflict or even anticipated conflict. I think those will produce good news stories. And look for things that haven't been reported. In order to know what hasn't been reported, you have to find out what's been reported. So you have to know the subject areas that you're working in, especially, and then try to find something that hasn't been reported or something that's new or something that's a new development. And again, ask people, ask who knows this, what's going on with this, what's going to happen. A lot of times congressional testimony and congressional reports are very good source material. You can mine them. Members of Congress will talk about something that has, only been mentioned briefly. They'll talk about classified things that are in an unclassified way and that will be reflective of stuff that can produce news stories. Okay, I think you had one question in the back there. We'll give you the last question.
I was just wondering what your thoughts were on the claim that certain news agencies are becoming more ideological. And I was wondering if you thought there were any pressure on reporters to report certain stories that kind of fit into certain ideologies.
I don't see that. I mean, my own views are that, like I say, in Washington, everything is tinged with politics. I do ascribe that there's a certain mainstream media bias. Like I said, I had a run-in with an Obama administration official who basically accused my newspaper of being a biased news organization. But, it's very relative in political terms. Most newspapers, they just try to shoot down the middle, but then they cover some stories that no one else will cover. I think gays in the military is one of them. That's an area that's a very hotly contested issue. The conventional wisdom is that, they should lift the ban. A lot of people in the military don't think it's a good idea. Yeah, that's probably as much as I have on that.
Yeah, I was just going to say that in the time that I was at CNN, for instance, I never felt any pressure to report a particular story or report in a particular way. But television is about ratings, is about selling commercials and ratings. And as it got more competitive, as CNN had more competitors, and show producers were empowered to try to win the ratings of their time slot, it became harder and harder to get certain kinds of stories on the air. So for instance, if I called CNN, as I did one time, and proposed I wanted to do a story about France was taking a larger role in NATO's military structure after having been away from it for a long time, I thought it was an important, significant change in the NATO alliance. No show producer at CNN was interested in running that story. They didn't see that as something that Americans would be all that interested in. And so there was a time when I first worked at CNN where I could just do that story and it would just run. By the time I left CNN, partly because of the increased competition, but that time CNN wasn't competing with Fox or MSNBC or anybody else. So there was a sort of a self-reinforcing process where certain kinds of stories, again, stories that had a villain in them or, showed waste, fraud, and abuse or some that provoked outrage, it was much easier to get those on the air. And so in that case, there was sort of a process in which the types of stories you kind of knew which stories you could do and get on the air and which ones were going to be a much harder sell. I mean, obviously, if you really thought something was tremendously important but nobody was getting on, you could sort of appeal and maybe get stories on now and then that maybe weren't going to be, big ratings boosters. But that was just sort of it was sort of a limited process.
Okay, thank you all very much. It's really